The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 14th chapter. Immediately after the feeding of the 5,000, when the disciples and Jesus were already tired, Jesus made the disciples go get into the boat and go ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, Peter became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. So, in today's Gospel, we have a couple things that I think are important. One of these is that this was a moment when Jesus and the disciples were worn out. They had spent the day in the hot sun. Jesus was teaching and preaching, and then at the end of the day, the disciples came to Jesus and said to him, "Jesus, there's 5,000 men plus women and children, and they're going to get hungry. I suggest we send them to the cities to get something to eat." And that's when Jesus, always sensitive to how tired his disciples were and how short they were feeling, said to them, "Well, then give them something to eat." And it's at that point that Jesus blessed and broke the bread, and they distributed it to the 5,000 plus, and the leftovers were 12 baskets full. You know, an analogy that those who were Jewish reading this text would recognize was the 12 tribes of Israel, and then some. There is enough of God's grace to go around with plenty left over. And so finally, after feeding all these people, Jesus took pity on the disciples and maybe himself, and they got into a boat and went to another shore, and then the disciples went out, and Jesus slept. And who can blame him? He just fed 5,000 people. And that's one of the things that I think really strikes me about this story is Jesus is all about being present exactly where he is. When he is in the moment and he's got 5,000 people, I don't think it matters how tired he is. He is going to make sure those people get the things that they need. You know, when it's time to rest, he's all in on rest too. So I find it really nice to hear Jesus resting, because I think so many times when we think of Jesus, we think of Jesus in action. You know, I think back to the action movies that I always liked, especially when I was younger, and my favorite one was like Die Hard and the Lethal Weapons were always my favorites. And they show those characters, you know, crawling through air vents and jumping out windows and blowing things up. But you know what they don't show them doing? Sleeping. You never see those characters sleeping. Why? Because it's a boring movie. And so I think that when we have the instances of Jesus needing rest, those are the ones that don't stand out in our mind as much, because they're the ones that don't fit the narrative of Jesus in action. And granted, he may not bust through windows, and he only drove people out of the temple with a whip of cords once, but that you really only ever get one shot at that, to tell you the truth. You know, the fact of the matter is that Jesus always spent time where he was, using it for that purpose. And, you know, I'll lift up something I've lifted up before, that Jesus had this pattern of preaching to the crowds and then retreating to a quiet place with his disciples or the people closest to him, and then taking time for himself to rest, and then going back to his disciples, and then going back out to the crowds, and then going back with his core group, and then himself, and then his core group and the crowds. And so we see this pattern emerge of Jesus' life, and we realize that One, when we say Jesus is fully human as well as fully divine, the fullness of Jesus' humanity is important, and we cannot underestimate, or we cannot overestimate the importance that had for him. And so if Jesus has to rest, and Jesus has to take time with his friends and his family, and Jesus also has to make certain times where he's able to be a part of the crowds because he's taken those times to recharge himself, how can we expect ourselves to be any different? And then the other piece of Jesus resting in this passage that I find so compelling is that even when the disciples were out in the middle of the storm, Jesus came when it was time. And in the Gospels, we see day and night used as metaphors for times of our humanity versus times of divine action. And there is no time where our humanity and our weakness and our vulnerability and our brokenness are more on display than during times of the night. Because at night, when we can't see anything, that's when, we not only can't see all those things that are good, but metaphorically we can't see the light of God shining through until the dawn breaks. When the dawn has broken, all of a sudden we begin to see something that is different. The disciples saw by the light of the breaking dawn Jesus walking across the water, Jesus calling to the seas to be calm. We saw in the light of the breaking dawn the gift of God with us. And we begin to realize something different that happens in this story as the dawn breaks. The fear is dispelled, and Jesus is with us. And in weeks like this, where we've been where I've been incredibly busy, because I started a new job, and everything that kind of could go wrong with my schedule went wrong with regards to that, and it was fine. And then Lauren's grandfather died, and so she had to fly back to South Carolina. It was one of those weeks where it felt like nighttime a little bit, even after being very well rested from vacation. And yet, one of the pieces that continues to shine in my heart this week as I ponder this text is that even though it's night, the dawn is about to break. And this isn't one of those let's let everyone see how happy we are, because when they see see our joy, all of a sudden they're going to see how much we love Jesus. So everyone should be happy and love Jesus. This is more along the lines of when you find yourself in the dead of night and your tiny ship is tossed. We have before us the breaking dawn of the love of Christ. And as we look out on that horizon, even in our moments of deepest night, we realize that it only takes a very little bit of light to dispel darkness. We realize that it only takes that glimmer of hope to dispel our fear. And I think this is why Jesus was saying to the disciples, "You of little faith." It's because they saw Jesus and that didn't comfort them right away. They saw Jesus and they thought he was a ghost. They were so caught up in their fear they couldn't recognize what was right in front of their face. And so this week, as we go out from your living room, I guess, I'd like for us to think about what is in front of our face that we're not able to see because of the things that are going on with us. Where are those places that the break of day is dispelling the night, so that we might be able to see God's love more clearly, whether it's through the people in our lives or those moments of quiet? And where are those places that we are daybreak for those who are still living in night, just by our presence, by a kind word of love? That's who we're called to be. We are called to be the day breaking through the night, so that the world might see by it. Amen.